My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. Specifically, I want to thank her for her recent rather incredible contribution of $10 million to our endowment fund, plus another pledge of up to $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you have a little change to spare, the Leon Levy Foundation will match your grant up to an amount of $5 million. And if you give us $1 million, we'll name one of the fellowships after you. Anyway, that's my pitch. Please note that our next event will be on Tuesday, March 11th at 6:30, when the illustrious biographer of the ancient world, Mary Beard, will present our annual lecture on biography. Her intriguing title for this talk is Misleading Lives, the Perils of Ancient Biography. So please mark your calendars for that. That will be March 11th downstairs in the auditorium. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so we can notify you of our future events. So I want to take this moment to say something about our current Orwellian circumstances. We stand here at City University on hallowed grounds. Academic institutions should be revered as vehicles for free and open intellectual discourse. But at the moment, universities everywhere in this country are besieged by deeply anti-intellectual political forces. I think you all know what I'm speaking about. They don't like books, and they also distrust science. It's just astonishing. As a biographer, I just want to remind everyone that we have seen this kind of anti-intellectualism before. Recall the McCarthy witch hunts of the 1950s. Perhaps this renewed hysteria will soon pass. In the meantime, we must take every opportunity to celebrate the writers and readers of books, and yes, biography in particular, and as we are doing tonight, our great poets. So on that note, I am delighted to welcome Adam Plunkett to discuss his extraordinary new biography, Love and Need, The Life of Robert Frost's Poetry. Adam will be in conversation with Heather Clark. I am proud to note that both Adam and Heather are former Leon Levy Biography Fellows. Adam Plunkett is a literary critic and has received fellowship support from such organizations as the National Endowment for the Humanities and has written for the Poetry Foundation, the New Republic, the New York Times, and the New Yorker, among others. Love and Need is his first book. Heather Clark is the author of 4 books on post-war poetry, most recently Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath, one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2021, as well as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Her recent awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, the New York Public Library Cullman Center Fellowship, and she holds a doctorate in English literature from Oxford University and lives somewhere outside New York City. Adam and Heather will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they will take questions from our in-person audience. This event is being live streamed, so hello out there to our virtual audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Thank you. Heather, I now turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you, Kai, and thank you all for coming on this Frostian night. The weather's very frosty and outside. I'm so honored to be here to celebrate the launch of Love and Need, your erudite and beautifully written critical biography of Robert Frost. It's so meaningful for me to be sitting here with you right now because we were Leon Levy Fellows together in 2016, 2017. And you were in the very early stages of this book. I mean, I think you hadn't even really started. I was a few years into Red Comet, and we were both rather serendipitously writing biographies of these iconic American poets who we thought had calcified into caricatures. And I think we both felt this sense of mission, right? That we wanted to reframe these poets, reframe them in a way that would allow for a more thoughtful more thoughtful sort of engagement with their legacy and their poetry. And we met for the first time right back there in that cafe. And, you know, we had a lot to talk about then, and we have a lot to talk about tonight. So let me get started. This is partly a biography about biography. You open this book with a meeting between Frost and his future biographer, Lawrence Thompson. Lawrence Thompson wrote a very famous or infamous 3-volume biography of Robert Frost. And when Helen Vendler reviewed the second volume, she said that Thompson had turned Frost into a monster. So can you tell us more about Lawrence Thompson and his biography and what that did to Frost's reputation, and to what extent you were writing against that, if you were?
Absolutely. So I'd like to start by first thanking the Leon Levy Center and thanking you for being here. We would not be friends, most likely, and we would not have been together at that stage in our journeys had it not been for this. And it was just remarkable. It was so important. I remember sitting there and talking about how it was so funny that we were writing very different books, but from kind of parallel problems. And you're writing about a woman who's I think the great American poet of the second half of the 20th century in America. And what she really needed was something big that showed how seriously that she had to be taken and how much one had to see the art past all the scandal back and forth of the life. And what I was trying to do was something similar, but I didn't think that Frost called for something big and totemic and serious. I thought that when people thought about Frost, they thought big and totemic and serious, and that was kind of an obstruction. And the Thompson biography that the book partly tells the story of is big and totemic and serious, and has a lot of things in it that are invaluable and irreplaceable, but also has a what I think is a pretty extraordinary story behind it that has shaped everything and how people have thought about Frost in the last 60 years or so. And it's hard to do a long and short of it. But what I will say in terms of your question about how to begin with it, I wanted to use that as a frame tale to try to think about how one can see Frost's legacy and understand it. Because the frame tale is partly the reception history, but also it's partly a way of seeing Thompson as a kind of figure for trying to make sense of Frost. And so he's partly a historical figure in the book and also partly a stand-in for the reader, who's also in this game of trying to make sense of somebody who I contend is not easy to make sense of.
How many years did he spend writing his 3-volume biography? It seemed like a lot of years when I was going through this. At least 10.
Well, depending on how you measure it, I'd say about 35.
Okay. Yeah. Because he met him so young.
Yeah.
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 And the very first scene in this biography is Frost meeting his future biographer. And so, you know, and then a lot of the second half of the book is about Lawrence Thompson's biography as well. So I just thought that was a very interesting framing device, you know, to start your biography with another biographer. And I mean, this is maybe an unfair question, but did you agree with Helen Vendler's assessment that this biography had done a lot of damage to to Frost's reputation, or was that unfair?
It's a fair question, and certainly I agree.
Yeah.
I think that I do not think Frost is a monster, to spoil it. But I think that the one thing that I try to do in the book is try to unpack why I think the myth has stuck so much. And I think that when people think about monstrosity, they think about it in terms of what we might call moral monstrosity, just being a kind of a bad person, a creep or a bad guy or something like that. And I think that's not what we're imagining in this case. I think it's something that's on a different plane of experience, and I think it's closer to a spiritual or a religious category. And I think that it's a testament to how Frost hits us, and the place he hits us, that there's something that he's tapping into that's so deep and feels wonderful, perhaps on the verge of transcendent in the art, that the sense that there's something poisonous in the character beyond that. The opposite is, a kind of monstrosity, but it's closer to a demon. And if that sounds crazy, I submit that it might sound less crazy 400 pages in, but we'll see.
Well, I think one of the ways you kind of, even avoid all of that, like the scandal in his own life and the tragedies, right, that he had to deal with. His son died by suicide. His daughter was institutionalized. I mean, there was a lot of tragedy in Robert Frost's life that he wasn't necessarily, to blame for. I love in this book how you braid literary criticism and biography, and it's something I wish literary critics did more of, actually. But we were all trained back in the 90s to separate the life and the work, and never the twain shall meet. And I don't think I'm overstating things when I say that biography was a dirty word in English departments back then. And to me, this book really epitomizes the advantages of what I think of as a biographical, critical approach, which I think you're helping to legitimize that, of embedding the life in the work and the work in the life. This book is much more, it's more literary, I think, than your kind of standard biography of a writer. There are extremely sophisticated close readings in this book. I mean, some of the strongest close readings I've ever read. They talk about transcendence. I came to Frost's poems with a new understanding of them. You feel like you're in the hands of someone who really understands Frost's poetry in this biography. And the reward, I think, is a more multifaceted and complex portrait of Frost as a poet. So you're coming at his life through his work. The subtitle is The Life of Robert Frost's Poetry. Tell us why you decided to center the life of the poetry in the way that you did, rather than the life of Robert Frost. We've got the life of Robert Frost's poetry. Why did you decide to kind of take that approach?
Well, first of all, that's really humbling. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about in the cafeteria down there, about the project, that I thought that part of the intervention the book had to make in order to try to have people see Frost differently was to appreciate not only the depth and not only how deeply the poetry was related, if not obviously, to what was going on in his life and in how he was making sense of himself and the world through this poetry that he's also trying to make sense of. It's also a figure for how we try to make sense of him and the world through him. But also, one thing that I discovered in my first year and a half or so of research, which is how deeply indebted he is to different traditions, and different traditions that were, to a small extent, inherited in some kind of straightforward sense, but really earned, really won. There's this sort of picture we have of what the New England of his time was, which is sort of, it's in the air that, you know Milton, and it wasn't like that. it's very studied, very learned, traditions of, classics and the King James Bible and, the great 19th century New Englandism, but it's also just great traditions of English poetry. And I think one intervention that I try to make in the book is to show that Frost is every bit as deeply indebted to the great traditions he's working through as the other great modernists of his period. It comes out very differently, and Frost is quite vain about pretending not to be, and so one has to go looking for it. But he leaves clues for you, and so that's. And part of the reason that the book moves slowly through some of this is not only that I like reading things like that. I'd rather like someone to show me than just tell me, as they say. But also, it partly was a self-consciousness about how those things would be taken, given into what disfavor biography has fallen by serious or professional readers of poetry. I thought that if I didn't make my case slowly and thoroughly, people would dismiss it. People wouldn't take my word for it. So I sacrificed some brevity and compression for the sake of trying to make the case at some length.
Well, I'm very glad you did, because they're just beautiful readings. And I was reminded of Helen Vendler, when I was reading them. What you were just saying brought your epigraphs to mind. So I'll read two. This one is by Robert Frost. The way to a poem is through as many as possible of all the other poems that were ever written. And the next one is by T.S. Eliot. We shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of a poet's work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. I was really struck by the intertextual dialogue you brought to these poems. Like you were just saying, I think a lot of us think of Robert Frost as someone who writes in this kind of New England vernacular, and these scenes at crossroads and in snowy woods just spring to mind. And no, I mean, he's borrowing from Wordsworth and especially Shelley. And Tennyson, you have a whole section here on In Memoriam. Milton, Keats, Dickinson. I mean, the list goes on. So it was so strong in terms of his dialogue with other poets, and also his dialogue with his contemporaries. And that's such a fascinating story. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about his relationship with T.S. Eliot, right? This is partly a book about tradition and the individual talent. He sort of had this rivalry with Eliot. I'm just going to read something from your book. Frost rejected Eliot's idea that a complex age called for complexity in art, an idea he likened to the absurd call for confusion in art in a confused age. So tell us a little bit about their friendship and rivalry, and to what extent Frost was writing against Eliot, if he was.
Yeah, I mean, Eliot drove him crazy.
Drove him crazy,
and Frost
right?
drove Eliot crazy. And I think one thesis of the book that is shown, I think, consistently by subtext is that Eliot's diagnosis of tradition and the individual talent applies very deeply in Frost's case. Mm-hmm. And I think that Frost knew that. And I think it drove him crazy. Because he still had an older, more conventionally romantic conception of the artist as original in the kind of standard sense of originality before Eliot tried to turn it on its head. And that it meant freedom from influence, having broken away from the influences of your predecessors. And you look in Frost and, it's all there. And I'm really glad you brought up the range of poets that Frost is drawing from, because one thing that I try to construct throughout the book is to show that there are all these leaps in things that Frost is picking up, and he picks up at different times different things that crystallize some of the insights of these great writers. So I think Frost is just an absolutely phenomenal reader
Yeah.
of these great predecessors. And he kind of crystallizes something wonderful in them, from Shakespeare's sonnets to, I think he was the first major writer really to be influenced by Dickinson. And I was pretty astonished to see that, because it was well before her reputation had been made.
Yeah.
But part of the rivalry was that Frost and Eliot approached their idea of their senses of influence in very different ways. I think the figure that I would use is that Frost was a teacher and Eliot was a preacher. And that Frost really wanted to try to appeal to people where they were and kind of deepen a sense of experience. And Eliot wanted a kind of Mandarin's authority.
Right.
And
Yeah.
achieved it.
Yeah.
And I think there are these wonderful ironies, which is that, I think Eliot, where he was best as a poet, is kind of like Frost, There's this, I think that people do a great disservice to him by teaching him so much, because it alienates you from the felt experience. I mean, you read, sit and read Ash Wednesday or something like that, or Preludes, and you don't, or, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and you don't need, it's good to study about it. It's good to study it once you have a sense of it, but you hit those sentences, and he's an absolute master of it. And so Frost's practice is much like Eliot's practice, but Eliot got the theory right about Frost.
Yeah, so it's almost like they're coming at this idea from different directions. I know Frost was not a fan of the wasteland. He called it scatteration. And I was fascinated to read that he, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the reason he wrote Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening was kind of in reaction to the wasteland, which he thought was this sort of obfuscating poem. But, if you get to the end of a poem like Directive, what is it, Drink and Be Whole again, Beyond Confusion.
Beyond Confusion,
and then the end of the wasteland, Shanta, Shanta, Shanta. They're coming at the same idea, but just through totally different routes. So I really enjoyed that conversation about Frost and Eliot, and also Ezra Pound. They were, and Edward Thomas, and these friendships. Frost was responsible for freeing Ezra Pound from his internment at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, right? So he had these friendships and rivalries, but it was, he weighed in at the end to help Ezra Pound, which, maybe that was, maybe he shouldn't have weighed in so much. But talk a little bit about the toast Eliot gave to Frost in, 1957 in England. That was a wonderful moment in the book where the rivalry kind of came full circle, right? There was a dinner.
It's a great part of the story. Some of them are there in the text, some are in a note, but I had about a page of different insults Frost had about Eliot over the years. And there are some that are really popularized, like, I like to play euchre, he plays Eucharist. But, there are, I think, literally 24 others that he came up with over the years. And Eliot just drove him crazy. And the kind of authority that Eliot was able to build from his criticism, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And, but Frost really couldn't abide. And this gets at your last question I realized I didn't answer directly, which is that in adopting the kind of Mandarin role, Eliot tried to prescribe and, like Pound, a sense of how art had to be in the age.
How art had to be, yeah.
And there is this ambition that people associate as the heart of the great high modernist project, that, by virtue of having art be a certain way, you're going to reframe experience and the imagination of the world, and that will reframe the world. And on many different respects, Frost does not buy it. He does not have that picture of art. He does not believe art can be mandated. He also has a different picture of civilization. He is not a systematic thinker. He's proudly unsystematic. He's not a rationalist. He thinks that you are going to contribute to imagination through art, but you are not going to reshape it wholly through that. And he has a principled suspicion of that kind of picture of an artist's authority. And that's what he's coming at in the prescriptions in the wasteland on all those different objections. And they have the rivalry is always incredibly awkward in the way that it always is when these artists meet, and Proust and Joyce can talk about the weather or something like that for 5 minutes, and the subtext is just burning. And there's one time when they're at St. Botolph's Club in Cambridge. I think it's 33, maybe it's 32, and Frost is just so piqued by Eliot giving a reading that Frost pretends to write a poem out on the spot to try to just take some of the air out of the room.
Oh my God.
And they just can't stand each other. And even on that trip, I'm not sure I made it into the book, but there's some reports you can't verify that Eliot says, "I've never met somebody who's so egotistical as Frost," which is rich coming from him.
Right. Right.
He thought he was God.
Yeah.
And then Eliot gives this toast in 57 at the English-speaking Union, if I'm remembering that correctly, where he says that Frost has a kind of localism, but it's a kind of localism that is universal in the sense of the relation of Dante to Florence, or
Yes.
of Shakespeare to his corner of England. And then he says that something to the effect of, it's the most distinguished and eminent Anglo-American poet.
Anglo-American.
Anglo-American.
Poet. And you said he paused before he
pauses
said
before it.
Anglo-American,
Yeah.
so that he could include himself in that. Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah.
it's so big and so gracious of Eliot. It's it's incredible. And you can listen to the recording. And Frost says afterward, he's actually at a loss for words, which he never is in public. He says there's no one living on either side of the ocean that I'd rather hear that from. It's just absolutely incredible.
Yeah, that was a really intense moment in this book. And I just I'll move on in a minute, but I want to read a couple sentences that for me, really crystallized this difference between Frost and Eliot and their different conceptions of poetry and what a poem ought to do, but maybe not so different, right? The route they take to get there. It was Frost's charge that Eliot took it upon himself to re-educate his audience, which was against what Frost stood for in both art and education. Of these two eminent conduits of New England literary tradition, these two men who had spent formative years in and around Boston and Cambridge, one was a Brahmin and the other a schoolteacher, the one pronouncing on a world he meant to bring in line with his standards, and the other cultivating individual initiative by force of example. The one writing for a cultural elite, and the other trying to meet a broader public where they were. So we can think about whose vision sort of won the day, but we need to move on. So we start out as biographers with a specific sense, maybe, of who our subject is. We have a sense when we start these books. But our research often surprises us, right? Especially as the years go by and by. And I know that happened for me with Plath. I started out thinking she was actually a much more fragile person than in fact she was. I learned over the course of my research that she was an extremely strong person. And that new knowledge changed my understanding of the book I wanted to write. So I wanted to ask you, did your idea of who Frost was change over the course of this project? And if so, did the purpose of your book change too, or not?
I'll have to think more about the direct question. I'm sure it did. It's a little hard to recall. But the salient change for me was in my relation to Frost's ideas. Because I came into this as a real lover of Eliot. And the moment of genesis for the whole book was realizing that what I took to be some of the heart of how Eliot's poems work was operative into my own, the very first poem of Frost's very first collection. And it just floored me. I couldn't make sense of it. And so the real genesis for me in writing the book was that there were many ideas Frost had that seemed crude to me. I thought of kind of in Eliatic terms. And for me, coming to see Frost was coming to not always agree with him, but have a kind of regard and a respect for you know, in a lot of senses, the opposite.
So you started out seeing him almost through like Eliot's eyes, and then,
That's a really great way to put it. Yeah, I mean, I just think that I had much more of Eliot's picture
Okay.
of the role of the artist, the role of art, and you know, Eliot was really an intellectual, and Frost was no less learned, no less sophisticated, no less erudite, no less, I would say, on the verge of wisdom or profound or anything like that. But he didn't have the intellectual's perspective that the crystallization and the best way of approaching everything is through the idea. What Frost would say is that there's a book side to everything, which the more I think about it, the more I like, which implies that there are many things for which there's also a non-book side in which there is great insight to be gleaned. And you really see that radiate throughout Frost's whole vision of life, and I think there's great insight in even the parts of Frost that where I can't quite agree, and you know, where he lost a lot of favor as, you know, culture moved around him.
Yeah.
But I think some of those principles that were kind of against the current of the time are things that will, I think, help him to endure.
so it sounds almost like this deep engagement with Frost's poetry, in a way, changed your understanding of him. Maybe more than time in the archives, or reading letters, or just sort of sitting with these poems. And
Absolutely, and I would say too, you know, Frost, part of the reason this book took rather long to write is that he has an extensive archive, and it's a weird archive. A lot of it is in these very scattered notebooks, and I spent many years going through the notebooks, letters, which are also weird, and recordings and other parts of the archive, and trying to make sense of his ideas and how he thought about the world. And it's the more time I sat with it, the more it crystallized for me what he was getting at. But he doesn't invite you in.
right, yeah. And it was a process. It was a long process. What's your favorite poem by Robert Frost?
Oh, it's getting to the hard stuff.
I know I always hate when people ask me this question, but I'm going to do it to you.
Okay, I'm going to say either My November Guest or Bond and Free.
Do you want to read one of those if you have it on your phone? Or
Yeah.
Okay. Or in the book, yeah. It would be nice to hear you read a Robert Frost poem, or two.
Bond and Free. Love has earth to which she clings, and circling arms and hills about, walls within walls to keep fear out. But thought has need of no such things, for thought has a pair of dauntless wings. O love has left on lawn and lea her print in many a flowery place, from straining in the earth's embrace, and such is love, and glad to be. But thought has kicked her ankles free. Thought cleaves the interstellar gloom and sits in Sirius all night long, and comes at daybreak, winging strong, with a smell of burning on every plume, while love has slept in a little room. Her gains in heaven are what they are, yet some say love, by being thrall, and simply staying, possesses all, in several beauty that thought fares far to find fused in another star.
Why is that your favorite poem?
Another tough one. I won't attempt to be eloquent about it, but I think it's more beautiful the more times I pay attention to it. And there are a bunch of Frost poems that are like that, and there are a number he wrote sometime between, say, the mid-aughts and the mid-20s that I think are as good lyrics as anything we have in the language. And that just happens to be my favorite of, maybe a large handful, I could say.
What do you think, maybe his best poem or couple best poems?
I think that of those lyrics, Heilebrook, Bond and Free, The Road Not Taken, certainly, and a handful of others, it's hard to choose the best. They're all kind of, I think, the perfection of a certain form, the lyric frost. I'd put Stopping by Woods in there, too. And then I would say that Birches is is also a perfection of its kind, and it's the narrative and pastoral frost, but condensed into something closer to a lyric form. And so I'd say, if that's not too much of a cheat, that I'd put those two.
Yeah, no, and I love your reading of Birches in here. You go into quite a bit of detail about, is it Milton's influence in Lycidas? Yeah, and you just opened the poem up for me in a way that I never expected it to be opened up. And so thank you for that. Love and Need. Why the title, Love and Need?
I think that it encapsulates the great conflicts in the book, both in Frost's life and his own psychology, and in the kind of enduring conflict at a higher level of abstraction in the poetry, and I think makes a claim to how that conflict in the poetry was his working through and trying to work beyond that conflict in his life.
So it's a sort of underlying thesis or vision that you see running through his poems.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. I love the title, Love and Need, and I love the life of Robert Frost's poetry. When I published Red Comet, I think I cut, 300 pages, something like that. So I'm just wondering if you had to do that, and you had to get rid of things that you maybe didn't want to get rid of and wished you had more space for. What was the editing process like?
Oh gosh. The initial draft was about twice this long.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah.
And it didn't need to be.
Yep.
I think that one thing that was nice in going through it was that, going through it to edit it, was that I think that it was very helpful for my writing process to have the 800 or so page version, this behemoth, and then realize that there was a slimmer book in here that I think would still be probably a lot for readers to go through, but that was the crystallization and the best version of the bigger version of it. But the book spends less time than I think a lot of biographies of artists do, giving the broad survey of everything the writer does. For example, the Frost's second book, which did more than anything else to make his reputation, North of Boston, is extraordinary. I don't talk about it very much because I think it's actually quite well understood. And I didn't think that needed the intervention. But the book really, it hinges on what I think are, a couple dozen, maybe some more, of Frost's greatest work, and what I take to be, if I may be so bold, discoveries about where Frost is getting this stuff, about The Road Not Taken or Stopping by Woods or things like that. And there was more in the first version that were other things that I discovered that helped me to make my case, and that didn't need to be there. It was good for me to know it as part of the foundation, but it didn't actually need to get into the the finished product.
Right, yeah. So how did you find that slimmer biography within the, 1,000 pages, that 1,000-page behemoth? How did you find this? Because that's the challenge, right? Is getting it under control, which you did. But I'm always curious because I think it's one of the most difficult things about writing a biography, right? Is just to clarify and find that thesis and find the shorter book.
I think that the first version had a lot also about Frost's different relationships. And I was just fascinated by the different ways in which Frost appeared to different people. One of Frost's friends said that Frost was a kind of contact genius, like Abraham Lincoln in a way, that he sort of shone differently based on different interactions with different people. And I think it's true. And I think that you see a different Frost in these different people. And the first version was built around these different relationships Frost had as kind of a figure of some different aspects of Frost's poetry. It was unwieldy. And I had a vision of the structure of the book that was more self-consciously, itself a modernist experiment in biography writing, that you would put these things together and they would, the overall gleam would help you to make sense of this, this very complex thing and some inherent properties of it. And it didn't work. And what I needed actually was the more Frostian version, which was what I hope is a good story.
Right. So you tried the Eliot version, right? You tried sort of the wasteland, like putting things.
It was bad.
Yeah, like collage, mosaic type, and went with Frostian.
Frost won the argument.
Okay. I'm glad he did, because it's wonderful. Another thing I wanted to get to is Frost's trip to Russia in 1962. This has always fascinated me. It's something I'm writing about right now in my own biography. He goes to Russia in 1962 at the behest of President Kennedy to meet with Khrushchev. He's a kind of American cultural ambassador. He's 88, right? He's very tired. This trip takes a lot out of him. But he meets with Khrushchev. They talk poetry. He gives Khrushchev his collections. It's astonishing to me that this happened. And he's with the poet and translator Franklin Reeve, who is Christopher Reeve's father, right? Which makes it even more surreal, right? Franklin Reeve is translating. What does this say about Frost's cultural standing at the height of the Cold War, that JFK sent him to Russia to meet with Khrushchev? And what does it say about poetry's power then and poetry's role now in politics?
It's an incredible story.
It is.
I will definitely recommend your book coming out that talks about it, but also To Russia with Frost, the Reeves book about it. There's so much one can say. It's an amazing story, and I could only touch on it briefly in here, in part because it's well told elsewhere, but in part because it's very hard to get started on it and not just keep going.
Right.
I mean, everything about it is uncanny.
Yeah.
But to your question about Frost's role and poetry's power, I think one thing that's pretty amazing about Frost meeting with Khrushchev is that Frost says that as we have this rivalry between our kind of democracy and your kind of democracy, which was a real diplomatic concession on Frost's part. But he's engaging in diplomacy. I mean, he takes it seriously as a diplomatic mission, which is makes it all the more extraordinary. Yeah. And he says that let's be a rivalry like Athens and Sparta.
Yes.
And we're going to compete for greatness of civilizational flourishing. We'll compete on games. We'll compete on these things that will try to perfect civilization the right way, the best way possible, and not by direct conflict. And it's amazing. And I saw that at first, and I was like, why is he bringing up Athens and Sparta? This is silly. But that's one thing that you learn reading it, is that Frost, he comes to understand American civilization in part from the classics. He kind of comes to America second in some ways, although the other, I think, defining thing about Frost's sense of America is that he's just younger enough than so many of the modernists that his defining sense of war is the Civil War and not World War I.
Right.
And that changes everything in his sense of history, of his preconception of whether war can be justified. And I think it's a great meeting between him and Khrushchev. Khrushchev had real regard for him. He sent a telegram of consolation personally after Frost died. The story ends on a tragicomic note, which is that Frost comes back, he's exhausted, he's coming down the plane, and he has one of his asides. He says, Khrushchev joked about how, he thinks America's too liberal to fight. And it's one of his, jokes about liberalism. And this caused an international controversy. Kennedy was furious.
Yeah, Kennedy was not happy about that, right?
And he couldn't quite fit in a sense of authority. And, but to the force of your question about the role of poetry,
it's hard to imagine, a poet being sent to meet with Putin. I mean, it's just, you can't even.
Well, and part of what it is that Frost is not writing for what he called in the Eliot and Pound vision of being caviar to the crowd. Mm-hmm. Frost is trying to write for everyone.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any less depth or sophistication, as I contend, but the surface is just as interesting and just as deep. Mm-hmm. One has to go into it. Mm-hmm. And the Frost has an extraordinarily deep appreciation of not only human nature, but of American civilization that he's able to bring to the poetry and imbue in it. And he's not marginalized into this kind of category of art seen as separate and a kind of pleasure for the crowd. He really is at the heart of things, and he's able to show that, especially in his later years. And I think that's still available to artists, but it shows, I think it's the great reflection of Frost's concern with really trying to meet people where they are, but not leave them where they are.
Mm-hmm. It's a great example of soft power, isn't it? Okay, last question. What do you hope this book achieves?
Another easy question.
And I guess what I'm getting at is Frost's legacy, right? And what you would like that to be.
It's a great question, and I think there are a number of different ways I could answer it. But I think one thing is that I mean to, part of the reason why it was so important for me to write this as a book that I hope people of very different backgrounds read is that I don't think Frost's rightful place is in academia alone or just in arts worlds alone. I think he belongs in and has a tremendous amount to contribute to common culture. And I hope that this book does something to try to move him toward, what he said is, what he would talk about is trying to find something, that's there in human nature. I think it's there. And I hope people can discover it a bit more through the book.
Yeah, and rediscover. I mean, he's one of our greatest poets, and I'm thrilled that you've brought him sort of back into the cultural conversation in, I think, a very important and timely way. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to take questions now.
Adam, Heather, thank you both for a wonderful conversation. It's Henry Breed. You used a word regarding the journals and his papers that really drew me, really intrigued me. Weird. Can you talk more about that? Was he being Leonardo-like? Was he writing backwards so that no one would know what he was doing?
I'm glad you asked that. I think, this actually gets at a question you asked earlier about how my sense of Frost changed over the years. He's an extraordinarily strange person by temperament and inclination. And you really see this, I think, if you look closely at his early years. I mean, he is just a strange person, you know? He kind of comes to understanding not only, I think, the world around him, but language really primarily, I think, through doing these wonderful Latin translations. I mean, he was a better classicist than Pounder Eliot. And his English prose style really comes into English in this very idiomatic Americanism through these much, much more Baroque and formal constructions of grammar, syntax, meaning, and understanding. And you really, really realize the closer you get to Frost's unpublished, or not volitionally published, you know, his letters, notebooks, all these things that are private, just how strange his mind and imagination were. And it's really helpful to see how strange the unfiltered Frost is, because it lets you realize and it gives you license to see all the strangeness under the surface in the published work.
This will be a little long. First of all, I heard Frost read at Williams College. I think I was a freshman or a sophomore, so 59 or 60. And someone asked in the audience to Everett, why don't you write in free verse? You know the quote, right? He said, it's like playing tennis with the net down, which I thought was so brilliant. Many years later, Jonathan Galati is here. A great guy called Lawrence Thompson, who died last year, did a series called Voices and Vision for public television. And I had the privilege of being asked by Lawrence, who did I want to write about? And I said, Frost or Stevens. I think they're the best 20th century American poets who are dead. And Lawrence Thompson said, you can't have Frost, my wife is doing Frost. So many, many years later, I had this gig, I'm a freelance writer, which was to do a CD-ROM. We haven't ever talked about this. CD-ROM about Frost. Oh, cool. And I was so knocked out by this speech. I was a freshman or sophomore maybe, and I thought maybe someday I'd be a writer. And this guy knocked me out. I mean, he was so captivating and bright and funny and responsive. We started the CD-ROM. He did the same damn speech over and over and over again, which depressed me a great deal. But now reading your book will make me undepressed. Thank you so much.
The funny thing, well, that's awesome. I'm excited for the CD-ROM. The funny thing about listening to those recordings, I'll go back in my archives and see if I have that one, is that it looks like that. You know, he's really, I think, closest to a stand-up comic. You know, he has his, material that he returns to. And it feels like that. You listen to the first 24, but you get into the 200s, and you see the divergences. You know, he has these sort of starting points, and then he improvises. And there's a lot of, I think, fascinating stuff in the very deep B cuts about how the improvisations go.
One other thing, there's a poem I've never been able to get out of mind, which is Once by the Pacific. It's so cool. Do you feel the same way about it? I can't get it out of my mind.
The shattered water made a misty din. It's incredible. Of an early memory. So I think it's something that he couldn't. Yeah. Was as if some night of dark intent. It's something he couldn't get out of his mind either. You know, it was a very early memory, and there was a couplet in it that he started when he was an undergrad at Dartmouth, so it would have been 1892, and then he turned into the whole poem later, so it was something that was worked from memory to verse to actual publication over about 40 years, give or take, 39, maybe 35, call it, but yeah, he couldn't get it out of his head either.
One more thing. The Eastern poet writes about the apocalypse starting from the West. It's extraordinary. They say New England poet. No, more than
one thing that you really see in some writers who have these unbelievably vivid imaginations of place is that they were uprooted when they were young. You see it with Tolkien, you see it with Kipling, and you see it with Frost.
And he was from he was the West Coast.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize that, right? That he's got sort of the heart of a Californian. He's the great New England sage, but actually, right, he's California.
And kind of like everyone who comes to something in a way that doesn't quite feel right, he overperforms it a little bit.
I have a question for you. To what extent, when you were doing the literary, critical, biographical, did the biography not, like, what is the limit of biography? Where does the biography stop for you? And where does the criticism begin? And is the literary value, like when you are trying to define what's great about Frost as a poet, does biography stop at that point? Or do you feel like you were able to see it continuously?
It's a great question. I think it stops. The poem is written in sections that are, I believe, Roman numeraled in publication. And I think that the stopping is meant to indicate that these are things that are operating on parallel tracks, but don't necessarily depend on each other analytically. That's a very abstract way of saying it, but to your point, it's meant to give people a sense that there are some times in which we're doing the biography, but it's meant to come close almost asymptotically, but then to be on a different plane.
One more question? Anyone?
So you said earlier that when you were writing the book initially, you kind of viewed Frost in some ways through Eliot's eyes and having a preconceived potential notion of maybe what an artist should be like or how to talk about them or bring them to the world, and that changed over time. Do you think that the way you look at art and the writing you create in the future will also now be broken from some mold you might have had before? Is there a way you view art differently in terms of what you create and how you perceive other art now that you've gone through that transformation yourself with your book?
Well, Mark, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. And I think it's a great question to end on, because I really feel very marked and very changed by the experience of spending this time with Frost. And there's a whole really, really deep well of a kind of sensibility and way of dwelling in and regarding the world that I got from my years of exposure, and that I think is there for people to be able to get from Frost. I mean, the book is just the starting place. You know, the poetry is the real thing. But yeah, absolutely, and it's something that I'm really grateful for, and I'm sad not to be working on them to an extent, but also, not an hour goes by that I don't think about something Frost related. So you don't totally have to say goodbye. They will not find me changed from him they knew. You can look that up.
That's a great note to close on. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for writing this book, and thank you all for coming. Adam will be signing copies of Love and Need if you would like to purchase one. And I'd like to also thank Shelby White and the Leon Levy Center for their generous support and for funding us, right? Our books would not exist without the Leon Levy Center, so thank you so much.